Unraveling the Aryan Myth. How European Philology Invented the Aryan Race, written by Dr. Jai G. Bunsell, an analytical exploration of Professor Christopher Hutton's study of philology's descent from linguistic science to racial dogma, showing how Europe's search for human origins produced the Aryan fabrication, an idea that nourished imperialism, nationalism, and ultimately the horrors of the Holocaust. This essay examines Christopher M. Hutton's The People That Never Were, Linguistic Scholarship and the Invention of the Aryans, Oxford University Press, 2025, a 284-page work of remarkable depth and moral clarity. Across 8 meticulously argued chapters, Hutton performs an autopsy on Europe's grandest intellectual enterprise, philology, and exposes how a discipline that claimed to unite humanity through language gradually learned to divide it through lineage. What began as a grammar of connection evolved into a genealogy of power. The book opens like a detective story about the world's most consequential fabrication. At its center lies a question that once captivated 19th-century Europe. Could the origins of humanity be reconstructed through language alone? Comparative philologists believe the answer was yes. They compared verbs as naturalists compared bones, convinced that grammar could trace the evolution of civilization. Their search for kinship, however, soon became a system of classification and eventually exclusion. Hutton approaches this transformation with a historian's precision. His interest lies not in villains, but in mechanisms, the quiet interplay of scholarship, bureaucracy, and ambition that turned linguistic discovery into racial ideology. Comparative philology, born as a bridge between cultures, slowly hardened into a hierarchy among them. From Sir William Jones's candlelit lectures in Calcutta to the racial charts of late Victorian anthropology, the same logic persisted. Language became evidence of ancestry, and ancestry, conveniently, justified authority. The book reads as both an intellectual history and a cautionary tale. Each chapter traces another step in the making of the Aryan idea, how a Sanskrit adjective meaning noble was stripped of its ethical substance, refitted as a racial emblem, and exported as Europe's civilizational birthright. This essay follows Hutton's argument with the same balance of irony and reflection. The drama remains, but the focus is on the slow, bureaucratic elegance of a deception sustained by reason rather than rage. Hutton's achievement lies in showing that the most enduring myths are not born in ignorance. They're manufactured in libraries, sanctified by scholarship, and believed precisely because they appear so rational. Chapter 1. Philology and Physical Anthropology. Every great intellectual misadventure starts with good intentions, and this one begins with a family tree. Europe in the early 19th century was buzzing with invention and anxiety. Steam engines roared, empires expanded, and the Bible was beginning to look like a shaky guide to human origins. Into this confusion stepped comparative philology, the proud new science that promised to reconstruct the entire story of humanity armed with nothing but verbs, roots, and boundless hubris. For a brief and dazzling moment, philology was Europe's favorite toy. The discovery that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the Germanic languages were members of one vast family seemed to reveal a common ancestry uniting half the planet. Ex Orient Lux, light from the east, became the rallying cry. Suddenly, Sanskrit wasn't an exotic curiosity muttered by distant priests. It was the lost elder sibling of Europe's classics. The revelation was intoxicating. Civilization, it seemed, had an even older pedigree, and it spoke like us. But the moment a scholar draws a family tree, someone starts arguing about who sits nearest the roots. August Schleicher obliged with his elegant language trees, showing Indo-European tongues branching gracefully from a single trunk. His diagrams looked calm, organic, and scientific. They also whispered hierarchy, sturdy central branches near the source, delicate peripheral ones straying toward decay. The metaphors did the quiet work of ideology. It didn't take long for the measuring tapes to appear. If languages had ancestry, perhaps speakers did too. Physical anthropologists soon joined the philologists, calipers in hand, converting words into skull types. The romantic cult of the voc, the mystical unity of language, soil, and soul, gave the partnership a moral glow. Speaking an Indo-European tongue became more than a historical coincidence. It became a birthright. Hutton points out that the real danger was not overt racism, but the serene confidence of science. Philologists prided themselves on precision. Their comparisons were quantitative, their conclusions wrapped in the tone of neutrality. When they described one language as more advanced or closer to the original, it sounded like data, not doctrine. The vocabulary of evolution slid effortlessly into the study of grammar, and soon linguistic geography mapped neatly onto human geography. By mid-century, the transformation was complete. Philology had begun as a quest for kinship and ended up sketching social Darwinism before Darwin. What started as a bridge between civilizations became a chart of superiority. Those beautiful language trees, so elegant, so reasonable, turn out to have roots sunk deep in hierarchy. Hutton closes the chapter with his characteristic restraint and quiet irony. The worst myths, he notes, are rarely born from hatred. They arise from the longing to make history tidy. The philologists were not plotting empires. They were merely trying to catalog humanity. Yet their tidy diagrams offered empire exactly what it needed. A story in which difference looked natural and order looked inevitable. And so, with a few neat branches and a Latin motto, Europe discovered its favorite, illusion, that the grammar of a sentence could reveal the destiny of a people. Chapter 2. Sir William Jones' Every Myth Needs an Accidental Author, and this one begins with a man who meant only to flatter a language. Calcutta, 1786. A room full of powdered wigs, candlelight flickering on parchment, and a British judge named Sir William Jones clears his throat to deliver what will later be called the most influential footnote in linguistic history. In a single sentence, he observes that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin share a stronger affinity than could possibly have been produced by accident. The room nods politely. Somewhere history tilts. Hutton treats Jones not as a villain, but as a man caught in his own brilliance. A jurist, Orientalist, and romantic polymath, Jones admired India with a poet's intensity. He learned Persian for pleasure and Sanskrit from pundits whose knowledge he revered, if never quite treated as equal. When he called Sanskrit more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, he meant it as praise. He saw languages as a family, civilization as a shared inheritance. Unfortunately, even innocent metaphors have consequences. Jones believed in genealogies, the comforting notion that if words have families, so do people, and that all families have elders, heirs, and black sheep. His fascination with order and ancestry, harmless in itself, carried the faint scent of hierarchy. He loved the idea that civilizations rose from a single cradle. He also assumed that the cradle looked, thought, and ruled rather like Europe. Hutton lingers on the contradiction. Jones, the universalist, preached common origins while serving as a judge for an empire. He wrote movingly of Indian wisdom, yet considered himself custodian of its future. He was an abolitionist employed by a colonial machine that thrived on coercion. His famous Philology paragraph reads less like a discovery and more like a confession of European yearning, a wish that humanity's oldest voices might somehow sound reassuringly familiar. The danger, Hutton suggests, was not the sentence itself, but the phrase that slipped through almost unnoticed, a race of men. Jones intended it vaguely, perhaps meaning a lineage of speakers, but in that small phrase lay a conceptual trap. Later scholars widened it. By the 19th century, race had hardened from metaphor into biology. The brotherhood of languages became the bloodline of nations. Jones never uttered the word Aryan. He would not have recognized the monster his sentence created. His idea of kinship was humanistic, even utopian. All peoples bound by a shared origin of speech and reason. Yet his formulation offered the perfect raw material for those who came after. men less enchanted by connection than by classification. His paragraph crossed borders and centuries, cited, translated, and misunderstood until it stood as the charter for Europe's new creation myth. By the time Jones died in 1794, his discovery had already escaped his control. It had begun to feed on the very structures of power he served. Hutton's judgment is unsparing but fair. Jones's brilliance lay not in what he proved, but in what he made possible. He turned language into evidence, comparison into destiny. The irony is almost too perfect. A poet who sought harmony among nations inadvertently gave future scholars the grammar of exclusion. He never fired a shot, but he did load the barrel. Chapter 3. The emergence of the Aryan paradigm. By the early 19th century, Europe had developed a new hobby, organizing humanity. Scholars, missionaries, and bureaucrats alike were busily classifying the world into neat boxes: races, nations, languages, and even moral temperaments. But when Sanskrit burst onto the scene, the existing boxes no longer fit. The old biblical scheme of Shem, Ham, and Japheth was starting to fray, and the revelation that Sanskrit was related to Greek and Latin demanded a new label. Indo-European was accurate but dull. Aryan had flair, ancient, mysterious, and conveniently flattering. The term, borrowed from ancient Indo-Iranian sources, carried just enough authenticity to sound unimpeachable. It also carried echoes of nobility. Arya meant honorable in Sanskrit and Arya, noble, in Old Persian. Perfect, thought Europe. How fitting that civilization's ancestors should have called themselves noble. And so, a harmless linguistic term was reborn as a badge of destiny. Hutton reconstructs the process with clinical patience. At first, Aryan was simply one option among several. Indo-Germanic for the Germans, Japhetic for the biblically minded, Indo-European for the cautious. But Aryan soon won the popularity contest. It sounded heroic, exotic, and, most importantly, European enough to own. From the start, naming was not an act of discovery, but of self-projection. Once named, the family tree began to grow in strange directions. Scholars divided humanity into linguistic races: Aryan, Semitic, Hamitic, and Turanian. Each came with a set of adjectives masquerading as facts. Aryan meant rational, progressive, and creative. Semitic became its foil: rigid, emotional, and spiritually obsessive. Hamitic and Turanian filled out the supporting cast of primitive or barbaric outsiders. These are not scientific categories, but cultural allegories. Europe had found a way to dress its prejudices in academic robes. Then came Arthur de Gobineau, a French aristocrat who saw history as a long process of racial decay. In his essay on the inequality of human races, he declared the Aryans the original creators of civilization and blamed humanity's decline on racial mixing. It was a grimly elegant argument. Inequality was not a failure of justice, he wrote, but the price of progress. Hutton allows Gobineau's own words to indict him. Proof that the line between linguistic genealogy and biological hierarchy had by then almost vanished. The real drama, Hutton observes, unfolded in the opposition between Aryan and Semitic. What began as a linguistic comparison turned into a moral duel. Philologists spoke of flexible Aryan languages and crystallized Semitic ones. The vocabulary of grammar became the vocabulary of character. Semitic speakers were portrayed as incapable of abstract thought, Aryan speakers as naturally philosophical. By mid-century, this linguistic polarity had hardened into cultural dogma, and eventually into political ideology. Yet the process was less deliberate than inevitable. Every academic label, Hutton argues, concealed a territorial claim. The scholars who coined Aryan were not inventing racism. They were mapping Europe's anxieties. Their trees and tables did what all good metaphors do. They seemed to explain everything while quietly choosing sides. By the end of the chapter, the transformation is complete. Aryan is no longer a grammatical curiosity, It is a civilizational crown. The same term that once described a group of languages now designates the supposed architects of progress itself. It has become flexible enough to mean whatever the user wants: racial lineage, cultural genius, even divine mission. Hutton's tone here is unmistakably damning. The scholars believed they were refining the dictionary. In fact, they were drafting a mythology. And like all good myths, this one spread easily, demanded loyalty, and was nearly impossible to correct. A single word had climbed out of a footnote, donned armor, and started conquering continents. Chapter 4. Philologies collide. If Chapter 3 named the myth, Chapter 4 shows how it was stitched together from pieces that never belonged in the same story. The word Aryan was not discovered. It was assembled, like a jigsaw puzzle built from fragments of Sanskrit ethics, Persian imperial pride, and European insecurity. Hutton opens by tracing the term back to its original habitats. In the Sanskrit world, Arya simply meant noble in conduct, someone who lived with discipline, civility, and respect for Dharma. The laws of Manu used it as an ethical category, not a racial one. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna calls Arjuna Arya as a moral reminder. Rise to your duty, act with honor. Across the Vedas and Upanishads, the word marked behavior, not ancestry. But the word's moral tone was easy prey for European translators eager for grandeur. 19th-century philologists rendered Arya as noble in a biological rather than ethical sense. The quiet virtue of the term became an inherited status. In this small semantic slide, from how one acts to who one is, the racial Aryan was born. Then came Persia's contribution. In old Persian inscriptions, Darius the Great described himself as an Arya, a proud son of the Iranian plateau. For him, it was a claim of lineage and territory, an assertion of belonging to a people and a land. Centuries later, when European Orientalists examined those inscriptions, they immediately linked Arya to Sanskrit Arya. What had been a royal boast became proof of a single, ancient Aryan nation stretching from India to Greece. The logic was irresistible and entirely circular. If Indians and Persians once called themselves Aryan, and Europeans shared their languages, then surely Europe too was heir to that nobility. A word meaning honorable in one context was now the title deed to civilization itself. Hutton reconstructs the resulting scramble with restrained disbelief. Indian scholars insisted Arya was moral. Persian historians said it was national. European philologists declared it scientific. The debate was never fought on equal ground. The European side had the printing presses, the universities, and, not incidentally, the empire. In that setting, dissent was merely another form of local color. By the mid-19th century, the transformation was complete. Aryan had become a global passport, issued by Europe, stamped with Indian and Persian symbols, and valid for political use everywhere. The word's new owners were not linguists but ideologues. The fusion of philologies, Indian, Persian, and European, produced something no single culture had ever met: a racial archetype. Hutton calls this process what it was: a remarkable act of intellectual appropriation disguised as scholarship. The Europeans did not steal the word. They colonized its meaning. They extracted moral and spiritual capital from ancient texts, stripped the term of its local context, and rebuilt it as the cornerstone of their own genealogy. By the chapter's end, the metaphor of construction becomes almost literal. The Aryan was a house built from borrowed bricks. Indian ethics for the foundation, Persian kingship for the facade, and European anxiety for the roof. Once completed, it stood so tall that even its creators mistook it for a natural landmark. Hutton's tone here is quietly cutting. No grand conspiracy, no deliberate fraud, just the tidy machinery of empire doing what it always does, translating admiration into ownership. A beautiful word meaning noble became a code word for supremacy. And so, with one more act of linguistic sleight of hand, Europe managed to turn another civilization's moral ideal into its own ancestral mirror. The Aryan was now fully alive, an invention no one could unmake, striding confidently out of the pages of grammar books into history itself. Chapter 5. Invasion Theory and the Aryan-Dravidian Divide. Every empire needs a creation myth, and the British found theirs in a grammar book. The story was tidy, flattering, and perfectly circular. Once upon a time, a noble race of light-skinned Aryans rode down from the north, conquered the dark-skinned natives of India, and gave them civilization. Centuries later, their distant cousins, white men from another northern island, returned to finish the administrative convenience. Early Orientalists, dazzled by Sanskrit sophistication, could not reconcile its elegance with their assumption that India was a land of decadence and superstition. The only way to preserve the hierarchy was to invent an earlier one. Thus emerged the story of conquering Aryans and conquered Dravidians, a myth that made colonization look like déjà vu. At first, the theory had everything an empire could want: noble founders, grateful subjects, and a linguistic pedigree linking London to the Vedas. Sanskrit's perfection was no longer India's achievement. It was evidence of European ancestry. The British, therefore, were not intruders, but distant relatives returning to set things right. It was ideology disguised as philology with impeccable footnotes. Hutton dissects the machinery of this myth with steady precision. Missionaries and civil servants began mapping the subcontinent along linguistic lines: Aryan in the north, Dravidian in the south. Census forms, school books, and gazetteers translated speculative linguistics into social reality. Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada speakers were labeled descendants of the defeated. Hindi and Bengali speakers, heirs of the conquerors. The categories hardened until even Indians began to repeat them as self-descriptions. The British administrators then added a clever twist. Sanskrit, once glorified as divine, was quietly retired as too pure for common use. Instead, they promoted vernacular languages, the supposedly natural tongues of the people, as proof of Dravidian backwardness and Aryan refinement. The policy had the double advantage of dividing India internally and keeping English as the impartial arbiter above the fray. It was divide and rule written in comparative grammar. Then the sand fought back. In the 1920s, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, planned cities with brick architecture, drainage systems, and no trace of invading chariots. The Indus Valley civilization had flourished long before the supposed Aryan conquest. The evidence refused to cooperate. The invasion, it seemed, had never happened. But the theory was too useful to die. It merely evolved. Scholars replaced invasion with migration, migration with cultural diffusion. The vocabulary softened, the hierarchy stayed. Civilization, the logic insisted, still had to come from somewhere else. The myth had become self-healing. When challenged, it simply changed costume and carried on. Hutton calls this intellectual tenacity what it is: colonial epistemology at its finest. The Aryan-Dravidian divide survived because it answered an administrative need to explain India's diversity as division and division as destiny. It allowed foreign rule to appear as restoration, not usurpation. Indian scholars, of course, protested. Some pointed out that the Vedas mentioned no invasion at all. Others argued that Sanskrit itself evolved within India, not outside it. But by then, the British had institutionalized the categories through censuses, education, and law. Resistance sounded like revisionism. By the early 20th century, the Aryan invasion theory had become less a hypothesis than a social fact. Political movements formed around it. Regional identities hardened within it. When the empire finally departed, the categories stayed behind, repainted, repurposed, and still quietly colonial at the core. Hutton ends the chapter with quiet irony. The invasion may never have taken place, he writes, but its consequences were real enough. A subcontinent taught to think of itself as conquered by its own ancestors. The damage was not in the archaeology, it was in the narrative. The Aryans never invaded India. The British did. They just made sure the paperwork said otherwise. Chapter 6. Language and Race. By the late 19th century, Europe had fallen in love with its own reflection. A few ancient grammars had convinced scholars that half the continent, and a respectable portion of Asia, spoke descendants of the same primeval tongue. It should have been a triumph of human unity. Instead, it became the foundation for a hierarchy. Hutton calls this the moment when linguistics and race science stopped exchanging letters and decided to move in together. Comparative philology, once the pride of the humanists, was now sharing an office with anthropology's skull measurers. Together, they built one of modernity's most efficient myths, the Aryan Superman. At the center stood Friedrich Max Müller, the celebrity scholar of his age. He spent his career insisting that Aryan referred to language, not blood. But every time he issued that warning, he described the original speakers as men standing on a high level of culture. The protest rang hollow. Readers heard what they wanted to hear, that civilization had a race, and it happened to resemble their own. Hutton's verdict. Muller's caution was genuine, but his adjectives did most of the damage. Around him grew what Hutton memorably calls the Great Muddle. In lecture halls, linguistic family trees hung beside racial craniograms. One claimed to trace verbs, the other skulls. Yet both pointed to the same conclusion. The further north and west you went, the closer you came to the source. When evidence refused to cooperate, scholars adjusted the maps. Archaeologists such as V. Gordon Childe scoured the steppes for the Aryan homeland, treating pottery shards like passports. The method was elegant. The logic was circular. Meanwhile, the hierarchy hardened. Indo-European languages were declared flexible and creative. Semitic languages became fossilized, Dravidian ones primitive. Colonial administrators translated this academic jargon into policy. Census takers in India ticked boxes labeled Aryan and non-Aryan, as if they were recording livestock breeds. Missionaries, armed with comparative grammars, decided which souls were more redeemable. Language had ceased to be a bridge. It had become a moat. Hutton argues that philology did not simply mirror racism. It provided its grammar. The language of descent, evolution, and purity that would later structure racial thought was rehearsed first in the study of verbs and nouns. The Indo-European tree was not an innocent diagram. It was a moral pyramid, with Europe conveniently perched near the root. Even those who disavowed biological determinism accepted its linguistic equivalent. By the turn of the century, the damage was institutional. Linguistic atlases doubled as racial maps. Museums displayed skulls beside verb charts. The scientific language of kinship had become the rhetoric of empire. And when the 20th century inherited these frameworks, it inherited their arrogance intact. Hutton closes the chapter with understated fury. The racialization of language, he writes, was philology's original sin, and its shadow still falls across modern scholarship. Every time we draw tidy borders around language families, we repeat, in miniature, the gesture that once divided humanity into natural superiors and inferiors. The Indo-European myth survives not because we believe in it, but because we still find its order comforting. The irony, of course, is that a discipline founded to prove our shared origins ended up teaching us how to separate ourselves. Philology began by tracing kinship through words and ended by turning words into walls. Chapter 7. Anti-Aryanism and Revivalist Aryanism in India. By the end of the 19th century, the empire's favorite bedtime story. The noble Aryan conqueror civilizing a darker, passive India was starting to sound less like history and more like propaganda. The problem was that too many Indians had begun to read it, and some of them decided to write back. Hutton treats this as the moment when a mirror cracked. For nearly a century, British philology had told India who it was, a land divided between northern Aryan conquerors and southern Dravidian subjects, its civilization a gift from outsiders. Now, Indian thinkers began to resist. Some attacked the story head-on, others rewrote it, and a few tried to turn it inside out. The result was a bewildering mixture of defiance, pride, and paradox, all of it playing on a field whose rules had been drawn in London. The first line of resistance was simple rejection. Archaeological discoveries at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, cities older than any supposed invasion, offered ammunition. If these urban centers existed long before the mythical Aryans arrived, then who exactly had conquered whom? Nationalist writers seized the point. The Aryan invasion, they argued, was nothing more than a colonial fairy tale designed to make British conquest look like a family reunion. But not everyone wanted to abandon the word Aryan. Some preferred to reclaim it. Swami Vivekananda restored the word's original moral and spiritual dignity, emphasizing that Aryan signified nobility of character rather than color or descent. In his speeches, most memorably at Chicago in 1893, he redefined the term as a universal ethical principle, open to all who seek truth and live by virtue. Through this interpretation, Vivekananda reclaimed a word burdened by colonial misuse and reaffirmed its true essence as a symbol of inner excellence and spiritual equality. Sri Aurobindo went further, transforming the Aryan into a symbol of cosmic aspiration, the seeker of light, not the wielder of a sword. His essays reimagined the Vedic Aryan not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim of consciousness. It was an elegant reversal, and entirely sincere. Yet, as Hutton dryly notes, even these reinterpretations left the original category intact. The cage had been repainted, not dismantled. Then came Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who decided that if the British loved origins, India could supply an even grander one. Calculating ancient equinoxes, he proposed that the Vedas were composed near the Arctic before the Aryans migrated south. In this version, India was not the pupil but the cradle of civilization. The geography flipped, the hierarchy remained. Ambedkar refused to play the game at all. For him, both the invasion and the indigene theories were distractions from the real issue, caste. The Aryan myth, he argued, had been built to rationalize inequality. It didn't matter whether the Aryans came from the north or had always lived in India. The story's purpose was the same, to keep the powerful on top and the powerless at the bottom. His critique cut through both colonial and nationalist romance with surgical precision. Even Jawaharlal Nehru, the modernist statesman who prided himself on rational detachment, could not entirely escape the vocabulary. In The Discovery of India, he dismissed the racial theory as absurd but continued to speak of an Indo-Aryan culture. The word had become habit, an heirloom no one quite wanted to throw away. Hutton's assessment is unsparing but sympathetic. Every Indian response, he argues, was ingenious but constrained. The empire had written the dictionary of identity, and resistance had to use its grammar. Whether they rejected, redefined, or reversed the Aryan myth, these thinkers were still wrestling with a European invention. The question was never, is the Aryan real? But who gets to define it? By the end of the chapter, the colonial mirror has shattered, but its shards still shape the view. The Aryan debate survives in academic departments, political rhetoric, and regional pride, each fragment reflecting a different version of the same illusion. Decolonization, Hutton suggests, is rarely clean. It often begins by arguing with the categories one should have abandoned. The Aryan may have been a phantom, but it left fingerprints on every attempt to exorcise it. The British had invented a story to explain why they ruled India. India, in defending itself, had to keep retelling it. Chapter 8, concluding discussion after 2 centuries of debate, excavation, and self-congratulation, Hutton ends with what can only be described as a scholarly postmortem. The corpse on the table is the Aryan, once the proud ancestor of nations, now revealed as a word that never meant what anyone thought it did. He begins, characteristically, not with outrage, but with evidence. The Sanskrit Arya, meaning noble, had been kidnapped, rebranded, and marched across continents under European supervision. In the process, it acquired a new wardrobe, race, destiny, and superiority. From the candlelit studies of 18th-century Calcutta to the bureaucratic ledgers of colonial India and the extermination camps of the 20th century, the word gathered meaning like soot on glass. What began as a compliment became a license. Hutton refuses to let anyone claim ignorance. The myth was not the invention of a few fanatics. It was the logical endpoint of ideas that respectable scholars cultivated with pride. The philologists drew the family trees. The anthropologists measured the skulls. The administrators filled in the forms. Each step looked harmless, even enlightened. Together, they produced a story that justified conquest abroad and hierarchy at home. The revelation, now stripped of metaphor, is simple. The Aryan never existed. There is no pure people, no master tongue, no single migration that explains civilization. What existed was a series of misunderstandings too convenient to correct. Europe mistook its own anxieties for evidence, its own ambitions for history. The language of kinship became the grammar of empire. Hutton's final chapter is both an autopsy and a warning. The Aryan myth is dead, but its DNA lingers in genetic testing kits that promise to reveal one's Indo-European ancestry, in political speeches celebrating civilizational blocks, and in schoolroom maps that present language families as harmlessly color-coded trees. Each is a quiet echo of the same illusion. That language can reveal destiny, and that difference can be measured. He argues that the real moral failure was not racism per se, though that followed inevitably, but the hubris of believing that language could serve as a mirror for the soul. The very tools that once celebrated human unity, comparison, reconstruction, genealogy, were recast as instruments of exclusion. When scholars began to treat grammar as evidence of moral worth, they transformed communication into classification. Hutton ends, as he began, with the image of the tree, the Indo-European oak that once promised clarity and order. It now lies, he says, as dead wood, a monument to intellectual overreach. The task for the present is not to prune it, but to abandon it altogether. We must stop using the vocabulary of lineage to describe human culture. Languages do not evolve like species. They move like rivers, mixing, splitting, eroding boundaries. In Hutton's view, the Aryan idea, despite the devastation it caused, reveals something enduring about the human craving for certainty. We are drawn to tidy genealogies over complex continuities and too easily mistake elegant diagrams for truth. His conclusion is neither sentimental nor indulgent. As long as we continue to seek our moral or racial origins in the structures of language, the ghost of the Aryan will continue to find new forms in which to live. The real act of decolonization, he suggests, is not to rewrite the myth, but to retire it. The people that never were have finally been laid to rest. What remains is the choice of whether we must keep visiting their graves.